Thank you so much, Stuart. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight or who might be watching this in the future. It's a very exciting time to be releasing a debut novel, but also a little bit of an uncertain time given we're all in the middle of a pandemic. So I do appreciate the support, and particularly given this is my first book and I am still a bit of a newbie. So this is my debut novel, Sticks and Stones. It's my little book baby. It certainly feels that way anyway. It's been about 5 years of work behind the scenes. So it's pretty thrilling to see it finally out in the world. It was released last Tuesday, so it's been out for about a week. And so far, the feedback has been really positive from people who seem to be really enjoying a very urban, very Melbourne crime thriller. So it is a police procedural. It's set in Melbourne and it follows my lead detective, Emmett Coben, who is head of the missing persons unit. And when we first meet Emmett, he's feeling a little bit bored and a bit unimpressed with the role that he's taken on. And that's because he feels like the unit is really quite under-resourced and understaffed. And he's left swamped with these really quite banal cases, which he thinks that local stations should be investigating themselves. But then he comes across this case of a missing mum. And this is really when everything starts to change for Emmett. He quickly learns that this missing mum left her 2 children at a holiday program and never returned to pick them up. So it does seem highly suspicious right from the outset. And when he speaks to this missing mum's loved ones, they all tell the same story of this woman who was absolutely devoted to her children and part of this really tight-knit family, and there's no way that she would ever just leave her children. But it doesn't take too much digging for Emmett to discover that this mum has been keeping some pretty big secrets, and in fact so has her entire family. And suddenly he finds himself really caught up in what is the most complicated case that he has ever been involved in. And we see him go from one end of the spectrum where he was really quite bored and questioning his move to the head of missing persons, to the other end where he finds himself absolutely run off his feet under immense pressure and effectively chasing this really dangerous predator through the streets of Melbourne. So this book is largely influenced by my background. I have been a reporter for about 13 years. I have been proudly telling people 10 years until recently when someone corrected me the other night. And they were correct. It's been 13 years, so quite a while in the media, particularly these days when it can be a bit of a tumultuous career. I've worked across print, radio, TV, and online. And I did start out as a sports reporter, as Stuart mentioned there briefly. In fact, I was working for the Herald Sun newspaper, covering a lot of AFL footy and things like that. And it was only when my editor at the time insisted that I help cover the death and funeral of Carl Williams that I found myself getting pulled into a very different direction. Now, I'm sure most people know that Carl Williams was one of the most notorious underworld figures. And we, of course, were experiencing this wave of gang crime through Melbourne during that time. But having said that, my passion was in sport, and I really didn't want to get involved with this initially, if I'm honest. And I was sort of dragged kicking and screaming by my boss into covering this huge news story. But once I became involved, I really was absolutely intrigued by this other world that I realized is going on almost in front of our faces day to day, that we really don't know, most of us anyway, don't know it's even going on. And I have to say, covering the funeral of Carl Williams is still one of the most surreal experiences that I've ever had. It was held in this very small church in Essendon. It's quite a beautiful old church. And I still remember walking up and there were these beautiful purple flowers everywhere, and it was really quite idyllic. And then you had all the underworld figures and really some quite shady people attending. And you had all the undercover detectives all mic'd up, ready to go in case there was trouble. And on one side of the aisle, you had, people who thought of Carl Williams as nothing more than your average suburban family man. You had his family and friends and neighbours. And on the other side, you had some really infamous characters. And it was such a juxtaposition between Carl Williams' average suburban bloke and Carl Williams' kingpin of this underworld empire. And that's when it really started to get me thinking, gee, you know, people wear masks day to day and we all pretend to be one thing and really maybe we have something else going on behind the scenes. And it really did feel like a bit of a peek behind the curtain into a whole nother life that was going on that certainly I had never considered at that point. And so from then I voluntarily moved myself into more of breaking news, crime reporting, covering court cases. And that really has been at the centre of my career for the past 13 years or whatever it is now. So all of that sort of experience certainly influenced me writing Sticks and Stones. There was a case back in 2014 that I would like to mention as well. And this, I still believe, was one of Melbourne's most horrific and brutal murders. And this was the murder of Renee Lau. It bothers me that even as I say her name now, probably many people won't know who I'm talking about. I don't believe this case ever got the publicity or the attention that it deserved, but it was a brutal, horrific, absolutely horrific crime. So Renee Lau was a fairly young woman. She'd moved over from Hong Kong, and by all accounts, she was living the life of her dreams in Melbourne. She was working as a pastry chef. She was volunteering at an aged care home, and she was singing as well at a local choir. And she just met this man who became her boyfriend, who she thought was absolutely fabulous. And so she really was absolutely loving Melbourne. And she was walking to work one morning when a man quite literally grabbed her and dragged her off the street. And he inflicted the most brutal attack on this poor woman, just off King's Domain around Melbourne's Royal Botanic Gardens. This attack lasted over 80 minutes, and she was conscious for most of this time. And I will never forget sitting in court and hearing the details of what this man did to her. It was extraordinarily brutal and graphic. And in fact, I remember the prosecution getting up and saying that the injuries that he had inflicted on her reminded them of someone who'd been in a severe car accident. Some of the evidence photos we saw, some of the detail, I mean, that will never ever leave my mind. But what also won't leave my mind is the fact that the offender, Scott Allen Miller, was sitting there in the dock just meters away from me, so close, you know, you could almost reach out and touch them, looking quite normal, being quite lucid and aware what was going on. And yet he was yawning, he was completely disinterested. He felt absolutely nothing, in his own words, about what he had done. And for me, it made me start to think, how on earth does someone get to that point where they can do something this horrendous and still not feel anything? What kind of a person is that? And what was really interesting about this case as well was that Scott Allen Miller had almost no history of prior offending. And that's extremely rare for a case so brutal like this one. Normally there is quite an extensive history of misdemeanors that will build up to something so brutal. But in this case, I think he had one minor infringement, which was from when he was living in Western Australia, and that was about it. So the question for everyone, including the prosecution, really became, well, what made him do what he did? And when he told police and when he spoke in court, all he could say was that he just snapped. That was in his own words. He just snapped and exploded into a rage. And so I started to look back into his history a little bit and think, well, you know, is he just evil? Is he just inherently evil, or has something happened to him? And certainly it became pretty clear once I started to look back through his sort of childhood history and all the documents that were placed into public viewing through the court, was that he had suffered a fairly unstable childhood. He had been the victim of neglect and abuse And there were clearly issues there that hadn't been dealt with, and he clearly hadn't had the support that he needed to get back on track. Of course, I'm not condoning him in any way. You couldn't possibly condone what happened. It was horrific. But it was very interesting to me to look back and see all this damage that was created in the past and how it's potentially resulted in this damage in the present and going on into the future. And this is something that started to really intrigue me when I looked at court cases, that 9 times out of 10, perhaps even more, it's the case that the offender, whether they're male or female, nearly always has suffered some form of abuse as a child or a teenager and clearly hasn't been able to reconcile with whatever has happened, hasn't had the support. And that's really a central theme for me in my book, Sticks and Stones, this idea of damage in the past creating damage in the future, and that cycle of neglect and how it does radiate through society. And the way I've tackled that theme is to use a series of flashbacks. So the book is set very much in the modern day, but we see flashbacks to a little child who has a fairly unstable upbringing. We see them fall through the cracks time and time again, even though they nearly get back on track quite a few times. And it's just a way for me to show people that there is more than what we often report in the media to these crimes. It's not simply innocent victim, evil offender. There are those shades of grey in between. And being able to put some of my experiences into a novel means that, of course, none of this is real and it is absolutely fiction. But I am able to explore some of those topics and those themes that have bothered me while I sit in a courtroom and see so many of these cases time and time again. And just on that topic, I'll say that's not even just for the most serious offences. So it's not even when we're talking about murder and things like that. In fact, I was in court just a couple of weeks ago covering a case of 2 men who had stolen a Porsche and had used it to ram police cars. Now, this was a bad crime, and certainly they endangered the lives of several police officers trying to arrest them, but it's also certainly not in the worst category of offending. And yet, when the judge sentenced these men, he read out the history of the offenders, and one of them in particular, their childhood was just extraordinarily neglectful. I was sitting in court and there were some seasoned reporters next to me, and we all gasped and looked at each other like, how on earth is this person even standing upright? Off the top of my head, I can remember that this man, when he was 6 years old, his father beat him virtually to a pulp because he didn't like the way he brushed his hair. Then when he was 8 years old, he left him to sleep the night in a cemetery. And he made the comment that, well, I wish you were dead. I'd rather you were dead so, you can get some practice and stay here overnight. I mean, can you imagine being an 8-year-old and sleeping the night in a cemetery? Then when he was about 12, he had just started to get back on track and was, he'd made some friends and he was playing at his local footy team, and that was apparently giving him a bit of confidence and getting him back into society. And his dad came to watch a game and was apparently so horrified by how incompetent this poor child was that he started injecting him with amphetamines before every game, supposedly to improve his performance. And when you hear stories like that, again, you're never excusing the behaviour, stealing the Porsche and ramming police cars and putting people at risk. Of course, you never excuse it, but it does make you wonder, what chance did that kid have? What can we do to potentially identify these sort of people so that they don't end up at this other end where all they feel like they know how to do is to lash out and to offend? So it's something, that is very, very central for me through Sticks and Stones. And one thing I would love to hear from readers once you do get a chance to read my book at the end is how you feel about the killer when you finish the novel. I would be really fascinated. Of course, I'm telling you he is a killer. So of course he's awful, but I am interested to know whether humanizing him in some way with his backstory makes a difference to people's feelings. So I will just take a break for a second and check in with Stuart and see if we have any questions. Stuart, are you with me? To the killer in my book? Okay, well, it's a very difficult conversation to have because I think when you're talking about real life cases, there's a feeling, certainly when you're a journalist, when you're a reporter, there's a feeling that all the attention should be on the victim and we should be telling the victim's story and we should not be sympathizing with the offender at all. And that's a feeling that I largely agree with. I mean, there's absolutely nothing that can excuse the behaviour, particularly when I look at what someone did to Renee Lau, when I look at the violence that's so often inflicted on people in society, and these people are completely innocent. There's nothing that excuses that, and there's nothing that will make me feel sorry for these offenders. But I think the conversation that we don't have often enough is what has happened to them in the past. Often that conversation gets blocked because people think you're sympathizing. My feeling on that is that if we don't ever have that conversation, we're missing out on potentially an opportunity to identify these sorts of people and potentially put in extra support services in place so that these people don't end up so far off track that they feel like they have no opportunity but to offend. As far as the killer in my book goes, of course, he's fictional. I really did enjoy writing from his perspective, particularly as a child. I really enjoyed writing the flashback scenes and being that child and putting myself in that headspace of, desperately wanting to feel like I fitted in and just not getting that reaction from people that I felt I needed, and always just that sense of like I'm always just left behind. It was quite a enjoyable sort of point of view to write from. I don't know if that makes me a bit twisted, but it was something I really felt like I could get myself into and empathize. I won't say sympathize, but certainly empathize with that point of view. Yeah, well, I think the big issue is that we always tend to see the end result, which is the crime at the end, and we are reactionary. And there is a role for that, of course. There's a role for police and there's a role for courts. But ideally, of course, and I'm saying something very obvious, but ideally we're not getting to that point. And the only way we're not going to get to that point is if we look at what's actually causing these people to offend. And that's that whole nature versus nurture debate. Are some people just born inherently evil? And are they just a ticking time bomb and there's nothing we can do? Or are some people perhaps, do we as a society perhaps create these monsters inadvertently? Is there something we can do to go back and put those extra support systems in place? My sense is that it's probably a combination of both of those things. I mean, certainly there are some behaviours that most of us would think it wouldn't matter what happened to us, we wouldn't behave in this manner. But then again, most of us haven't been brought up and created in the way that many of these people have. So I just think that's a topic we need to look at without sympathising, but certainly empathising, just so that we start to potentially address causes rather than always only looking at the end result. Not anyway. No. Um, yeah, it's interesting. That was actually, this book is told from multiple points of view. And out of all the characters I had to write, the killer was the one I found myself most easily setting into I think because before I started the book, I had his motivation very, very clear in my head. And so because I had that motivation and I knew what his background was going to be, I could write from that sense of feeling quite sort of almost angry at the world and resentful and feeling like, you know, I'm entitled to things that I haven't been given. It was almost quite a freeing perspective to write on, because if you feel like the world owes you, you know, it's that sense of entitlement that I'm sure some people would with. It's actually almost quite a fun perspective to write from, because you can do no wrong yourself. Certainly when you sit in court, what I find remarkable, absolutely remarkable, is how rarely offenders think they've done the wrong thing. There truly is this sense of, well, I didn't get this, so I did that. Well, she did this, so I did that. They're almost like they're proving a point. They've perhaps grown up feeling powerless, out of control, helpless, and they're now trying to exert some sense of power and control over their lives and over the lives of other people around them. It's obviously misplaced, but in their minds, again, I would say 9 times out of 10, if not more, they genuinely think that they are in the right. And that's something that probably for the rest of us is quite staggering. It's really quite sort of shocking, but it's actually not a hard perspective to get into if you start from the point of view that I'm not in the wrong. It's quite a fun perspective to write from. Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think most of us, you know, we all need to work on our sense of self awareness, because, you know, the first reaction to everything is always, well, I'm right. So how is this situation wrong? Whereas, you know, I mean, of course, though, when we're talking about crime, we're dealing with the extremes of human behavior. So it's a little different, but I still find it shocking when you get to that extreme, how many people genuinely think they are still in the right. Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is yes, I was. It sort of made sense to me straight away to have a reporter in there as my lead character. But once I played around with that idea a little bit, I felt a bit almost cringy about doing that. I think because I am a reporter, I mean, there are lots of books that do it really well, but I certainly am not equipped. I don't have the skills or the experience or the desire to run around solving crimes in my spare time. I haven't met any reporters that I would be confident to run around solving crimes. And so I think for me, that just felt so far fetched and also a little bit done at this point, that I thought I'm going to go back to basics and have a detective doing detective work. And it made sense to me. I mean, my book, I did want it to be realistic. You know, I did want it to be believable. Of course, it's fiction, and I have absolutely taken liberties with quite a few things, but I did want at the end of the day people to be reading it feeling like this could have happened. Yeah, well, interestingly, I have always wanted to write. I mean, from as young as I can remember, I wanted to be an author, and I always just thought I was going to be an author. That was always my thing since I was tiny. But I assumed I would actually end up writing women's fiction, commercial women's fiction. I think that's because it's what I was largely reading during my teens and early 20s. And in fact, I did attempt a couple of manuscripts in that genre. Um, they were horrendous. I'm not being modest. They were genuinely awful. Even I could recognize I didn't need to show them to anyone. I didn't need to inflict that on anybody. They were awful. So they went away, and I sort of actually put my whole goal of being a writer to bed for quite a few years. And it was only because my career took a bit of a weird path and ended up in crime and court reporting, that I started to think about these other themes that I truthfully hadn't really considered before, and started playing around with that. And once I started writing crime, it felt so natural. And the thing I love about it is that you can play with extremes of human behavior, and you can play with those real extremes of motivation, like perhaps you can't in other genres so realistically. So it does give you a freedom that I didn't find in my previous work. And I think it's just where I'm meant to be. Now that I've done it, I can't imagine doing anything else. I am really, yeah. This was always intended on being a series, and I deliberately left the door open to have a series, and I've actually almost finished, not quite. The book I hope will be the second one in this series. Yeah, well, it's a very overwhelming, daunting process when you are starting out looking for a publisher. And when you are a debut author, I'm sure if anyone watching is doing their own writing projects and is trying to get to this point, you will understand what I'm saying, that it's really hard to know if what you've written is good enough. It's really hard to know. I mean, you can pick up multiple books and say, well, this book's better than mine, this book's worse than mine, this book's completely different. But it's really hard to know, has my book got that X factor or that thing that's going to make it stand out? So I made a deliberate decision that once I had done rewriting, and I did a lot of rewriting, I actually did 7 full rewrites before I felt like I could show it to anybody. Once I'd done that, I made a very deliberate decision to target someone specifically in the publishing world and get some feedback. I didn't want to just send my manuscript out on a wide submission base and just sort of end up in slush piles and hope for the best. I really wanted a bit of one-on-one time with someone who could give me a bit of feedback and advice about what I needed to do. So I came across this program, which was through the Faber Writing Academy, where you had an opportunity to sit down with a literary agent for 15 minutes, and they would look at your first 3 chapters, and then they would give you some feedback on that as to whether it was ready to submit to a publisher, whether it needed a bit more work, all that kind of stuff. So I went to this meeting really excited, thinking I was going to get all this feedback and I'd be able to really improve my manuscript. And I remember walking in and sitting down in this room, and I was a bit nervous, of course. So I was sort of a bit shaky, and meeting this woman, Jacinta Demaze, who's a literary agent. And she opened up her notebook, and my name was on the top of this page, and the page was completely blank. And I remember my heart sinking, and I thought, maybe I haven't read the guidelines correctly. Maybe she doesn't look at crime. Maybe my book's so awful, she just has no feedback except stop writing. And I remember just sitting there sort of paralyzed. And she said to me, oh, yours is the book I have no real feedback for, because I'd just like you to send me the whole manuscript, please.
Wow.
Yeah, and I was really, like, that was really lucky. And I sent her the whole manuscript, and she pretty much signed me up on the spot, which I'm probably annoying people saying that, but I was really lucky. Like, she obviously saw something in it that she liked.
Yeah, I know a few writers who are about ready to kill you now. Yeah.
Well, if they read my book, they'll have some tips on how to kill me and harmful. Um, no, so that part came remarkably easy, and I was shocked. She did give me some feedback on how to improve the manuscript once I'd signed up with her, and I took all that on board and did do that. We then sent it out to all the major publishers, and this for me was when things got a lot more complicated, and I'm glad I had an agent, because the feedback from the publishers was completely contradictory. Like, I had one publisher sort of, oh, I like it, but it's too dark. And I had another saying, I like it, but it's too light. And another saying, like, it was all over the place, the feedback. I don't think there was 2 that were the same. And thankfully, a woman at Penguin called Beverly phoned me and gave me a bit of, almost I'd say, a bit of a talking to, like a bit of tough love, saying there was so much she loved about my manuscripts, but also so much that she didn't like. And would I be prepared to work with her to completely change quite a few aspects? And this for me was the best thing that I could have, because I'm well aware you only get one shot at a debut novel, and you only get one shot to really make it the best you can. And although, it's always nice to hear people say they just love things as they are, I appreciated the fact that she thought it could be better and was prepared to work with me on that. So that's why we ended up going with Penguin. And I'm extremely grateful. I mean, Beverly put in a huge amount of time helping me. I did another full rewrite, changed a lot, and then we did another rewrite after that. So that's 9 rewrites this book has gone through top to bottom. And now I'm very happy with the end result. But to answer that question, I would 100% recommend not just sending a manuscript out to everyone to start unless you are really confident what you've got is good. I would try to go that route of trying to get feedback first, and feedback from someone in the industry, not just from a very well-meaning friend. And it may cost you a little bit of money. Mine certainly did, but it was really worthwhile to do that.
Awesome. So by nine rewrites, do you mean you you restructured and you rewrote parts of it, or did you do 9 full redrafts? Like
I did a lot of full redrafts.
wow.
I mean, like, this is why it took 5 years, I think. I literally went back to the top of my page, hit the enter key, 6 times, pushed everything down, and rewrote top to bottom. Looking back, I think I also probably just needed the practice to really get it as smooth as it could be. And I probably wasn't clear enough starting out exactly what I wanted this book to be either. It was such a jumble initially, but yeah, it did take me a lot longer than I thought it would.
Yeah, so even from the beginning of the drafting stage to the end, I bet you learnt a lot.
I learned a huge amount. I mean, I learned that I'm probably the world's worst procrastinator, and I can come up with any reason to not write, even when I really want to write. And so getting that discipline to get my bum in the chair and just get the words on the page is something I'm really proud of, because that did not come easily for me. I'm very good at talking about what I want to do, but actually making myself do it is really hard. I should give credit to my dog for helping me to sit down and sit at my feet. He was wonderful for that. Get a dog. That's a big tip if you're trying to write. But yeah, I also learned a lot as far as the actual research goes into this book. It's one thing for me to have sat in a lot of courtrooms and to feel like I know a lot about the criminal justice system and things, but I did have to do a lot of research on police procedure. I had to reach out to people within Victoria Police to actually get some assistance, because once I got started, I realized, I don't actually know if they would do this or if I'm just imagining they would do that. And I wanted it to be real. So there was a lot of back and forth between particular detectives and officers who were wonderful in helping me. But again, that took a lot more time than I was expecting. But I'm happy with the result. I think it's worth the effort. But everything added on weeks, months, years by the end.
So have your friends in the police read your novel now?
Yes. In fact, one of the detectives who was instrumental in helping me just sent me a message this morning saying how much he loved it.
Oh, excellent! You must have done something right.
That was very nice. Yeah. I mean, I think he was swayed a little bit by the acknowledgements. So I think he was very happy. So that's a good start. So far, the feedback has been really positive. I've been really, really lucky. I think Australian crime is doing quite well at the moment, although mine is a little different, and I was nervous about this because I have set it in Melbourne. It's very urban, it's very Melbourne, and I did worry that at the moment most Australian crime that's doing really well is set in the outback or in the bush or by the beach. It's very Aussie in flavour. And I wondered whether maybe people are not going to feel like this resonates with them being very inner city book. But remarkably, I've been surprised. People seem to like that point of difference. So hopefully that feedback continues.
Well, as a librarian who reads a lot of crime and talks to lots of people about crime novels, I think sense of place is a big thing in crime novels that doesn't get talked about. Lots of the really popular, the ones that people take to heart and then talk to everyone about, maybe there's a great crime involved, and maybe there's some really cool characters. Actually, there's almost always some cool characters. It's always the place is a very important part of that novel, even if they don't talk about it. The ones they talk about always have this massive sense of place. Even the original things that set off a lot of the Scandi noir stuff was like Smiller's feeling for snow was always very much about the place. And that was even decades before the Scandi noir stuff really took off, but he started it. And then you got Ian Rankin, where Scotland is very important, and so I think you may have accidentally done exactly the right thing by trying to take a new place and making it very much about that.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. I'm certainly quite influenced by Scandinavian crime. I love Scandi crime. So, any reference to that makes me very happy.
Well, that's good. I think you've picked up the right sorts of influences. I've got one comment in the chat saying they got the copy this morning and they're only half a dozen chapters in, but they're totally hooked.
Keep reading.
Yeah, definitely finish it. I do have one fun question in the chat. They wanted to know what your tips for the footy were tonight, because it starts up tonight. No? Oh. I'm not from Melbourne originally either. I have no idea when it comes to AFL.
Go Tigers if the Tigers are playing. But I'm in book world at the moment. This is so consuming. I mean, I love my footy, but I don't think I've done anything other than think and talk about my book. That there could be an apocalypse going on. I probably wouldn't know.
I think there might be, actually.
2020, I forgot.
See, that's how focused you are. Someone is saying they reckon your book would make a great Netflix series.
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, I've had a bit of feedback and reviews saying it reads almost like a TV crime series. So certainly that would be a wonderful goal if there are any TV companies still makers watching.
Does your agent handle that kind of stuff? Have you got a film and TV rights deal?
Yeah, we're working through all of that at the moment. It is a bit of a weird time with coronavirus, obviously. It's slowing everything down around the world. So all of that process has been slowed quite a little bit. But I mean, I won't go into too much, but all those things are being looked at.
Excellent. Well, good luck. Well, we're almost out of time. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I wonder if there's anyone else has any other questions for the chat just very quickly? Or is there anything else you want to quickly talk about there, Katherine?
I'll be waiting to see if anyone else. I just want to say, if you do get a chance to read my book, feel free to let me know what you think, or if you have any questions. I'm on all the usual social media channels, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. If you do want to send a message, or if you have a question that we haven't got to tonight, I'm more than happy to answer questions about writing or media or the book itself. If you want to jump in and do that, that'd be great.
I do have one person connected to the library asking if you can come and do a live chat next time, when we finally can come and do them, because they enjoyed it so much. Come back.
One thing that I'm disappointed by, having a book out, it's such a milestone, it's 5 years of work. And I do feel like one thing, I don't want to be down, I'm very grateful, but I would have loved to do the sort of in-person events and meet people and have a chat, because you do get to talk to other writers and other people who are book lovers and crime lovers, and you sort of bounce ideas off each other. And this is wonderful, having these events, but it's not quite the same not having that chance to really interact.
Yeah, you can't see people's faces when they're asking questions. You can't necessarily know if you're hitting exactly what they were after. Yeah, it's a bit tough.
Yeah.
But there's a chance for a bigger reach, though. So hopefully you'll be able to talk to more people this way in the long run. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Katherine. Now, I do want to just remind everybody that Katherine's book is published by Penguin Random House and is available for purchase from the local bookstores. You know where they are. We have lots of great ones around the region. You can also buy it online at booktopia.com.au or at penguin.com.au to get it directly. Now, this talk will be on our YouTube channel, it'll also be on our website for further listening. And I also want to remind everybody, I'm sorry, that feels a bit rude talking about somebody else while Katherine is here, but I also have Alice Robertson's Glad Shout, another book set in Melbourne. Alice is going to be coming to talk to us on Thursday the 25th of June, so that's in a fortnight at 7 p.m. So once again, thank you very much for coming, Katherine. Thank you for coming and talking to us. Thank you everybody for watching, and we'll see you live in the branch as soon as we possibly can, Katherine.
Fabulous. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Bye.